Hello everyone, Mrs. Horn here. I'm going to walk you through some notes for Chapter 38, which is on sexual reproduction in plants. We're going to start off with a diagram and move through the different generations of plants. There are 24 slides worth of information, so if I go too fast, don't be afraid to pause the video. I have a picture here of a flowering plant life cycle, and it starts from the pollen attaching to the female part of the plant. There's fertilization, there's a zygote, embryo creates a seed, and then into a germinating plant, and then into a mature flowering plant which continues the life cycle once again. You should have the same diagram in your packet, and it should already be labeled. An angiosperm is a flowering plant. And an angiosperm, in that life cycle, in the picture that we just looked at, there are two different sections that make up that life cycle, and one of them is called the sporophyte. Now the sporophyte part of the life cycle is the part of the cycle where there's the actual flower. It's the part of the life cycle where the actual flower is. This is the dominant generation in angiosperms. It is a diploid form of the plant. Diploid meaning it has the full number of chromosomes, and it's represented by 2N when you see it written. And this sporophyte is the result of a union of the gametes. So that means that earlier in the life cycle there was a sperm and an egg, and when they combined, it made a zygote, which led to this sporophyte part of the life cycle. The gametophyte part of the life cycle, this is the part where it is in the anther of the plant, which is a male part of the plant, or the ovary, the female part. This does depend on the sporophyte parents. This is the haploid form of the number of chromosomes, which means it's only half of the complete number of chromosomes, and we represent that by just writing the little letter N. And the gametes are good examples of the gametophytes. Gametophyte kind of has the word gamete in it, so that's how we're going to try to remember that that's where the gametes are. During sexual reproduction in plants, fertilization occurs in the ovary. In the ovary, this is where there's a development of seeds which contain the sporophyte embryos, because once it's an embryo, it's considered a sporophyte, not a gamete anymore. The ovary will become the fruit. So think about that. Every time you're biting into a nice big juicy apple, you're eating an ovary of a plant. There's also the ovule, which is inside of the ovary, and the ovule will become the seed, which is a structure that we hope will carry on another generation of angiosperms. In the plant, this picture of the flower here shows us all the reproductive organs of a plant. The stamen has the word men in it, so we're going to remember that that's the male part of the plant. It consists of the anther, which is the top part here. That's where all the pollen grains are. The filament is the part that holds the anther upright. The carpel over here contains the stigma, the style, and the ovary. This is the female part of the flower. How about part of the flower? The stigma has a sticky platform here, suitable for pollen to not only land on it but stay on it. The style holds that stigma up nice and straight, and then the ovule is inside of the ovary. The egg is inside the ovary, and when fertilization occurs, it would actually occur right in the ovary. In order for that to happen, the pollen has to be released, and it has to land perfectly on that stigma. Each pollen grain will produce two things. They make a pollen tube, which will grow down into the ovary through the style. And it also produces a sperm, and the sperm cell is released once the pollen tube grows down. The sperm is released into the embryo sac. The embryo will grow, assuming fertilization happens. The ovule develops into a seed. The ovary becomes the fruit, which you're never going to look at an apple the same way again. Fruit dispersal will spread the seeds, so when wild animals eat, let's stick with the apples, when deer eat the apples and they digest them, they don't digest the seeds, and they deposit them somewhere in the wild, in the forest, and the hope is that those seeds will then germinate and grow more apple trees. Seedlings will grow and produce new generations of sporophytes, which are our flowering plants. Angiosperms either have a complete flower or they would have what we call an incomplete flower. To be a complete flower, it means you have all 4 organs. You have sepals, petals, stamen, and carpels. These could be called bisexual flowers because they have organs that are both male and female and can fertilize themselves. They have stamens and carpels. An incomplete flower is one that lacks one or more of those organs. They're also called unisexual flowers, and they are missing either the carpel or the stamen. So they have either the male part of the plant or the female part of the plant. But if you're an incomplete flower, you don't have both. An example of this would be a blueberry plant. Blueberry plants have to be planted with different kinds of incomplete flowers so that some will produce the pollen and some have the eggs. A monoecious species is a plant that has a stamen or a carpel on the same plant. Corn is an example. A dioecious plant is one that has a stamen and a carpel on separate plants. And this, I believe, is a pea plant. Our male gametophytes, we are talking about the male gamete, which is the pollen grain. We have one microsporocyte that forms 4 haploid microspores. The microspores will then divide by mitosis to produce a generative cell and a tube cell. So one microspore will divide to make 2 different types of cells. The generative cell will form 2 sperm when it lands, and the tube cell produces the pollen tube, which the sperm can't get to the egg unless the pollen tube grows. The female gametophyte is the embryo sac. This is in the ovary, which is the ovule is also in the ovary. In the sporangium, there is a megasporocyte that will divide by meiosis to make 4 haploid megaspores. So haploid would mean half the number of chromosomes because it's going to combine with another gamete. The megaspore divides 3 times, and it forms a bunch of things. It forms 3 antipodal cells. We don't really know what they do. They also form 3 synergids, and these aid the pollen tube in finding the eggs. It also makes 1 egg, and then it makes 2 polar nuclei. They are not divided into individual cells. They share the cytoplasm of the central cell in the embryo sac. Now the next slide I have is a picture of all these male and female gametophytes. So everything that you just took notes on, which was really confusing and lots of new terms, here it is. Here's everything on a diagram. So take a few minutes to look at this and look at your notes while looking at all of these steps so that you can put a picture to the words. Dioecious plants, which are unisexual, and they cannot fertilize themselves because they only have either the male or the female part of the plant. There is such thing as self-incompatibility, and this is where a plant can reject its own pollen. It makes a biochemical, it has a chemical that actually prevents the pollen from fertilizing. It's similar to an animal's immune system, which identifies something as foreign material and rejects it. In this case, it identifies it as self and rejects it. Double fertilization would be when one sperm fertilizes the egg to form a zygote. One sperm combines with the two polar nuclei and forms a triploid nucleus. That triploid cell does give rise to the endosperm, and the endosperm is the part of the seed that is the food storage tissue. That's what the seed is going to be using as food until it can grow some leaves and carry on photosynthesis. And this is a picture of all of those terms and what that means. And let's just look up here at the top. We've got a pollen grain that landed on the stigma. That pollen grain is going to grow a pollen tube. In the pollen tube I have two sperm cells, and if we look at the next close-up, that pollen tube is going to continue to grow right down into the ovary, and it will release the two sperm cells. I'm showing we now have a zygote that has the diploid number of chromosomes, and that means that's the 2N. And then here's the endosperm nucleus, and the endosperm is a 3N number of chromosomes, but that's not going to make another new individual. That's a storage that's going to make up the seed, and the seed is going to use that to stay alive and continue to grow. For embryo development, that zygote has two types of cells. It has a terminal cell, which will develop into what's called the proembryo, and that proembryo will develop into the cotyledons, and the cotyledons will be the first leaves that you see that the plant grows. The zygote also forms basal cells, and these are cells that help to anchor the embryo to the parent, and they also help to transfer nutrients from the endosperm to the embryo. And here's a picture of the embryonic development. Here's the zygote. That zygote splits into two, the terminal and the basal. The terminal becomes the proembryo up top. That proembryo becomes the cotyledon, just right over here, and those cotyledons will eventually grow into the first leaves of the plant. And that basal cell at the bottom, here it is right here, it's here, and it ends up right here. So the basal cell is actually holding this whole structure, holding it in place in the seed, so it's not bumping around in there. Now our mature seed, and we saw a few pictures of this when we did a coloring activity recently. A mature seed has different structures that we have to be familiar with. It has a hypocotyl, which is the embryonic axis. It also has an embryonic root, which is called the radicle. And then the portion of the axis that's above the cotyledons, this is called the epicotyl. So make sure you can find all of those structures on these pictures and put an image to the definition. The fruit helps to protect the seeds that are enclosed inside of it, and also aids in the dispersal of the seeds. So by having a fruit, it might attract animals to eat it, and once they eat it, they help disperse the seed. So the fruit is a really helpful thing to help get those seeds spread. The fruit develops only if pollination and fertilization are successful. So it's possible for the pollen to be transferred to the stigma of the flower, but it might not actually make it to the egg and fertilize it. But if there's an apple on a tree, it means that both of those processes has taken place. The fruit will ripen at the same time as the seed will develop. Apples and oranges, like I said before, are very exaggerated versions of fleshy fruit. Wheat and rice are also fruits, but they are not as dramatic as those apples and oranges. This is a few pictures here showing the development of a pea pod. So here's the original flower. The flower was fertilized. After it was fertilized, those petals fall off because we have no need for them anymore. We don't need to attract bugs or insects or any other pollinators. And then the pod starts to grow, and that's our fruit, and that's where the seeds are. Seed dormancy is an adaptation that some seeds have undergone to survive different conditions. Now, a condition of low metabolic rate, things kind of slow down, that's what this means when we say dormant. They don't grow, they don't carry on photosynthesis, everything is on pause. Dormancy is broken after a specific environmental cue is given. Cues could be a difference in temperature or a lot of rain. There are some plants that their cue is heat by a fire or extreme exposure to cold, certain hours of daylight, chemical attack by an animal. There are lots of different types of cues, and cues are going to be different for every type of a plant. The seed will take up water if the water potential of the seed is lower than the environment, which we've talked about water potential before, and if water potential is higher on the outside than on the inside, then water has a tendency to move in. The embryo is going to release a hormone called gibberellin. You learned about this in one of the Bozeman videos recently. And the gibberellin will signal the growth of the allurone. The allurone will secrete enzymes, which will hydrolyze food in the endosperm, which means it's going to start to break it down. And then those nutrients are now available to be absorbed by the embryo. This is a picture of some of the structures I was just mentioning in the notes, so make sure you can find everything on here before going on. And the last section of this part of the chapter talks about that seedling finally emerging, and the first to emerge is the radicle, so that's the embryonic root. The next thing that comes out of the seed is the shoot tip, and it's going to break through the soil surface. The hypocotyl will start to look like a hook, and when it's stimulated by light, that will trigger it to straighten and then raise the cotyledons up to the sky so that it can get absorbed light and start to carry on photosynthesis. The epicotyl will emerge as its first true leaves, and that's when photosynthesis can begin. And the cotyledons will then shrivel and fall off, and their food reserve has been consumed, and the cotyledons have no more function in that seedling because now that it has the true leaves, photosynthesis will continue to nourish it. And the last picture that I have shows that emerging seedling through a bean or a pea or a corn plant. This will get us through the first part of chapter 38. And there will be more to come on the next video for the second part of the chapter. And I hope this helps.